Hello, welcome to the mini lecture for the second module of History and Black Entrepreneurs. In this lecture, we're going to look at the period of time known as the Great Migration from 1900 through 1920. Most of the material that I'll be presenting during this mini lecture comes from the Library of Congress. The Oxford English Dictionary defines migration as the movement of people to a new area or country in order to find work or better living conditions. This was certainly true during the Great Migration period. During this time, millions of Black people from the southern United States moved north to cities where there was work. Why did this happen? Well, after slavery ended in 1865, many Black people continued to live in the southern states working on farms and in rural areas. But as the 1900s came into play, the Industrial Revolution began, and factories began to spring up in cities such as Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and other areas. Jobs were created there because there was a need for workers in those factories, so that millions of Black people moved north in hopes of creating a better life. Besides jobs, they were looking for housing, better housing for their families, better schools for their children, and more access to voting for Black men. During this time, women of any race were not allowed to vote, but Black men were able to vote. The southern states created many barriers to prevent that from happening, but in the north, there was more access to voting for Black men, giving them more political voice and more political power. That there were several impacts that benefited entrepreneurs. First point, it concentrated areas of Black people in certain places, so that if you were an entrepreneur trying to market your product, you would have a large group of people, for example, in Harlem, New York, that you could market it to, as opposed to it being spread out through many different farms and rural areas in the southern states. Second point, because there were jobs, people did have some more discretionary money to spend on different types of products, and that too is a benefit for entrepreneurs. The third point is that Black newspapers began to really spring up in different cities and different parts of the country. Newspapers spread not only news and information about what was going on, but there were also opportunities to advertise products and get the word out about what you were doing to places that might not otherwise know about your business. Finally, the forming of organizations to fight discrimination and foster Black empowerment, while not a direct benefit to most entrepreneurs, was very important, since a part of what the entrepreneurs did was help and support Black people's progress and success, so they became part of these organizations. One of the organizations that you may have heard of is the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Other organizations that sprang up around that time were the National Urban League and what's called the Niagara Movement, a group of Black intellectuals who made an argument for Black empowerment. There are some negative side effects to the Great Migration, and the biggest one that I want to speak about was segregation. Segregation is the enforced separation of different racial groups in a country, community, or establishment. 1900 through 1920 is also known as the segregation era, because that's the time when discrimination against Black people became legal. Laws were passed in many southern states known collectively as Jim Crow laws, and they mandated the separation of the races in many aspects of public life. For example, Black children and white children could not attend the same schools, could not drink from the same public water fountains, did not eat at the same restaurants or lunch counters, could not ride in the same places on buses. All of these were laws passed that mandated the separation of the races. Most of these laws happened at the local level in various cities and states of the South, but not all. There was support for segregation, and in 1913, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, introduced segregation into federal government agencies, including the post office and other agencies. That spread legal segregation throughout the United States, and those laws persisted through the next three governmental administrations. So this gives a little bit of background to what the time period was like when Black entrepreneurs began to do their work between 1900 and 1920. In the required readings, you'll be reading about Madam C.J. Walker, who was a very famous and very rich entrepreneur of the time, as well as more about the Great Migration and some of its impacts.